The year is 1916. Henry Farr stands accused of willful defiance to authority. He failed to charge, fight, and die as a British soldier in the greatest war of his time. His superiors report he has something wrong with his mental makeup, which makes him anxious to do his duty. By all evidence Judge Haig heard, Farr is presented as a coward. In truth, Farr's supposed cowardice wasn't as simple as this evidence made it seem, but the reality of the situation was in contradiction to everything understood about mental disorders at this time. Henry Farr was a victim of shell shock, caused by weeks spent in fear in the trenches of World War I. When he looked for help, he was dismissed because he didn't have a physical wound. Mere hours after his dismissal, he was ordered to fight in the trenches, the source of his fear. When he panicked, he was threatened, and 2 other soldiers began to shove him. Before long, he was screaming, struggling, and doing all he could to get away as he was forced towards the trenches. His illness prevented him from following orders. Unfortunately for him, his was an illness that many of the doctors of this time refused to take seriously. Henry Farr was found guilty of cowardice and was sentenced to death. As he was tied to a stake and put before a firing squad, he refused a blindfold so he could stare his killers in their eyes as he died. How did we reach this point? By most modern standards, this situation would be considered horrifying. But why can we see the horror now when the people of the past couldn't? What has changed from then and now that has affected our perspective of mental health so drastically? Henry Farr was a victim of the events that inspired change in our understanding. These events, the horrors of trench warfare in World War I, would cause such a dramatic push forward of the psychological frontier that a new age of mental health perspectives began. First, we should study the beliefs that led to the decision to execute Farr. Many cultures in history, from the British priests to the Greek philosophers, believed that poor mental health was caused by poor physical or spiritual health, and it was also understood that birth defects could cause a mental illness. However, the idea that somebody's experiences, like depression or trauma, could cause them to face a serious, long-term mental illness was not as popular as it is today. For example, in 1885, when the German insurance office mandated pensions for traumatized workers thanks to the work of Dr. Hermann Oppenheim, many German doctors diagnosed trauma patients with a gene-induced mental illness, hysteria, instead of a trauma-induced neurosis. This meant the workers couldn't get a pension. Then, in 1914, World War I began, a war completely different from any other conflict that came before, for 2 big reasons. First, the recent invention of the machine gun ruined old strategies like heroic charges and made standing out in the open dangerous. In order to avoid the machine gun fire, the adaptation was to dig down, forming trenches. Second, the sheer scale of the war. Millions of young men from every continent marched to join the fight in these trenches. The trenches, which were often dirty and overcrowded, were constantly bombarded by loud machine gun fire and explosives. Death was common. As one soldier described the sights in his trench, an everlasting nightmare. These horrors led to something called shell shock, which manifested as melancholy, twitching, or other ailments of the nervous system. Many victims of shell shock didn't have any kind of physical injury. From a modern perspective, the cause would seem to be the traumatic conditions of the trenches. However, from the perspective of the 1914 medical community, there needed to be a physical cause. As most shell shock patients were from the lower class, and most doctors were from the upper class, it was assumed that these patients were genetically predisposed to shell shock. At the beginning of the war, shell shock treatments were based on the genetic predisposition theory. Many patients were sent to languish in psych wards, ignored and forgotten. In Germany, the popular method was a Willenskampf, where the doctor would try to break his patient's will to command them to be cured. This was done through hypnosis, electrocution, or other methods. As one German scientist said, not a specific disease, but rather expressions of life are to be treated. The dismissal of traumatized soldiers as degenerates was similar to how traumatized workers were dismissed as hysterical in Germany in 1885. However, the key difference between the 2 scenarios is that the amount of German workers unfairly treated by doctors was a far cry compared to the amount of soldiers afflicted by shell shock in World War I. Hundreds of thousands of young men faced shell shock. This was a number that could not be ignored or forgotten. Necessity is the mother of invention, and in World War I there was a necessity for a good treatment of mental illness. In Germany, thousands of patients treated with a Willenskampf method relapsed into their old symptoms. The struggling medical community turned to the International Psychoanalytic Association. The IPA, which had for a long time criticized the Willenskampf but were only now being listened to, encouraged doctors to treat their patients with a talking cure, psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was founded on the understanding of the emotional causes of shell shock, not genetic causes, and became the standard shell shock treatment in Germany by the end of the war. In Britain and France, doctors needed to do something about the overcrowded psych wards. This necessity led to the invention of the revolutionary Maudsley and Moss Side hospitals. The Maudsley cared for its patients' physical needs with hot baths and open-air treatment. The Moss Side treated patients with emotional cures like psychotherapy, encouraging patients to stop repressing traumatic memories of the war. The gathering of many prominent scientists like Frederick Mott and W.H.R. Rivers at the Maudsley and the Moss Side was unprecedented in psychological history. Furthermore, the debate between doctors of the Maudsley and the Moss Side over what caused psychoneuroses gained the attention of the wider medical community. The IPA also rose in prominence, and by the end of the war it was a respected organization who offered insight into the best ways to handle shell shock. If the tragic amount of shell shock patients had never suffered as a result of trench warfare, mental illnesses likely would have gone unstudied for several more years. The development of the psychological frontier has had a massive impact over the past century. The IPA is now a major organization with members around the world. Many scientists who studied shell shock, like Sigmund Freud, would go on to make more discoveries. Furthermore, the mistreatment of traumatized veterans after World War I would grab the attention of the common citizens, not just the scientists. This new fascination with psychology would lead to several important scientific conclusions. Shell shock was officially labeled and recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Clinical depression, also mental illness caused by emotions, would be studied alongside PTSD. The scientific interest in psychology as a whole would lead to better understanding of mental disorders that were caused by genetics, such as autism, which was studied at the Maudsley in the 1970s. Now, in the 21st century, we are able to apply the things we learned from the revolutionization of the psychological frontier in World War I. Psychotherapy, which had a foundation laid by the IPA and the Moss Side Hospital, is now considered one of the best possible treatments for PTSD and several other mental disorders. There are several organizations dedicated to the support of veterans suffering from PTSD. While there are still problems with society's perception and stigma toward mental health, there is also support readily available for people who are struggling. One example of us using our better understanding of a historic situation to try and fix our past mistakes is the story of the second trial of Henry Farr, the descendants of Farr against the United Kingdom Parliament. The year is 2006. The UK stands accused of failure. The UK failed to support its soldiers and recognize the trauma they were going through, stubbornly holding to their belief that these men were degenerate cowards who were failures to the country. They executed Farr because of a misunderstanding. Now we have the gift of hindsight. History has given us understanding and has taught us that Henry Farr was treated wrongly. His execution was the result of age-old prejudices and the stubbornness of the medical community at the time. Now we can learn from the mistakes of the past and make right on those mistakes to create a world where the same mistakes are not made. Henry Farr and 305 other men executed for cowardice were granted an official posthumous pardon. At long last, they have been shown the compassion they deserved.